You already know what an iceberg is, and you already know who James Joyce is if you're clicking on this iceberg, so the only thing I'll mention right now is that the iceberg I'm using was created by Reddit user u/Kinadaria45, which will be linked in the description. Alright, let's get into it. Tier 1. Ulysses. Ulysses is Joyce's second and most famous novel, published in 1922. The novel follows Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus, a character from his first novel, throughout the single day of June 16th, 1904, set in Dublin, as with all of his other novels. The book is known for its experimental nature, with many of its chapters being in entirely different styles, including a first-person narrative, a catechism, and an 150-page-long play. It is also known for its intense difficulty, often being considered the second hardest novel in the English language. We'll get to the hardest. This is my favorite Joyce book, personally, and one of my favorite books in general. It is an absolutely amazing work. Dubliners. Dubliners is a 1914 collection of short stories by Joyce. The book contains 15 short stories following various citizens of Dublin as they go about their lives, with a consistent theme of the paralysis of Irish life during the time. It's probably his most accessible and normal book, and it's a great way to start your reading of the author. Many characters in it recur in Ulysses, which is also a good reason to read it first. Really good stuff, probably my second favorite Joyce work. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is Joyce's first novel, published in 1916. It follows Stephen Dedalus from early childhood to his college years, and is mostly concerned with his artistic development and how he breaks out of restrictive institutions such as the church. The novel can be seen as a precursor to Ulysses, mainly since Stephen and several other characters from it recur in the novel, but also due to its experimentation. It's tame compared to Ulysses, but it still has some interesting stylistic variation based on Stephen's age throughout the novel. The book is also fantastic, much like most Joyce works, and is another way to get accessible, or is another good way to get introduced to his works, since it's fairly accessible. Exiles. Exiles is a 1918 play by Joyce, and is only a theatrical work. It follows a couple, Richard and Bertha Rowan, who experience a fair amount of strife due to their relationship-based conflicts with two other people, Robert and Beatrice Hand. It's a pretty good play, but pretty easily Joyce's weakest work, which seems to be the common consensus, as it is probably his most forgotten work. Chamber Music. Chamber Music is a 1907 poetry collection of Joyce's, containing 36 poems. It's a decent poetry collection, very conventional by Joyce standards, but they're well written and quite beautiful at times. Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is Joyce's last novel, published in 1939. Ulysses was already a pretty experimental novel, but Finnegan's Wake completely blows it out of the water. The novel is allegedly in English, but nearly every word is a pun or portmanteau mixed with several other words, often from different languages. The novel is notoriously difficult, with most of the difficulty coming from the style, but the plot is pretty confusing too. It ostensibly follows a Dublin family of 5, Humphrey and Anna, the parents, and Shim, Sean, and Izzy, the children. However, the characters are more so used as archetypes than as real characters, and change names and traits many times throughout the novel. The book is mostly made up of semi-connected vignettes, strung together loosely. Even though it somewhat reads like nonsense, it is a pretty insanely impressive feat in writing, and quite a good novel if you can find a companion or something of the sort to go with it. June 16th / Bloomsday. As mentioned previously, June 16th is the day Ulysses takes place on, and it's celebrated annually by fans across the world as Bloomsday. Traditions on this day vary, but a common activity is taking a walking tour through Dublin of all the locations visited in the novel. Eating a large meal based on Leopold Bloom's favorite foods is another common event. Pretty fun holiday. Love letters. Some of Joyce's love letters to his wife, Nora Barnacle, are infamously insane and kind of hard to read. I don't want to get into too much detail, but to put it lightly, the man enjoyed a good fart. They are definitely, interesting to read. Not sure I'd recommend them. Joyce's family. Joyce, besides his wife Nora mentioned before, also had 2 children, Giorgio and Lucia. Lucia is probably the more relevant one to his life, as she was diagnosed with schizophrenia in the 1930s and was institutionalized for the rest of her life. The impact of all this on Joyce's life has been theorized to have influenced some parts of Finnegan's Wake. Censorship. Joyce's novels, particularly Ulysses, have had a long history of censorship since publication. Ulysses is pretty tame by today's standards, but in the 20s the cursing and sexual references seemed a lot more extreme, and as such it was banned for a lengthy period in several countries, including the United States, Britain, and Ireland. Poems Penny Each. Poems Penny Each is Joyce's second poetry collection, published in 1927, and containing 13 poems. It's pretty similar to chamber music in style, and it's also pretty good. Tier 2. Gilbert and Lonati's Schema. This refers to two official schemas for Ulysses, explaining chapter titles, mythological allusions, and various other aspects of each chapter of the novel. Neither were meant to be officially published at first, but they both eventually were. They're pretty helpful for understanding the book's structure. Ulysses, 1963 film. Not sure why this says 1963, but Ulysses is the title of a 1967 film adapting the novel Ulysses. The film follows the plot of the book fairly closely, and is supposed to be decent, though I can't say I've given it a watch yet. The Cat and the Devil. The Cat and the Devil, also known as the Cat of Bugency, is a brief fable in the form of a letter that Joyce wrote for his grandson in 1936. It's one of his more obscure works, and is much more accessible than any of his other later works. The fable tells the story of a mayor of the town of Bugency making a deal with the devil to build a bridge, with the catch being that the first creature to walk across the bridge is taken by the devil. The mayor gets a cat to walk across the bridge first, foiling the devil's plans. It's a pretty fun fable. Stephen Hero. Stephen Hero is the title of an earlier incomplete version of a portrait of the artist as a young man. Like Portrait, it is heavily autobiographical. Joyce started work on it around 1904, and had given up on it by 1905. Campbell's Skeleton Key. A Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake is a 1944 nonfiction book by Joseph Campbell. The book is a detailed guide and critical explanation of Finnegan's Wake, often held up as one of the most useful companions for understanding the novel. Lost Generation Cohort. The Lost Generation is a term referring to a group of Parisian writers previously from America in the 1920s. Joyce is often associated with these writers and was friends with several, such as Ernest Hemingway, but is usually not considered to be directly part of the group due to being from Ireland. Tier 3. The Sensual World, Kate Bush. The song The Sensual World by the musician Kate Bush, released on her 1989 album of the same name, is lyrically about and references the final chapter of Ulysses, which is Molly Bloom's famous lengthy soliloquy. Joyce and Ibsen. Henrik Ibsen was a famous 19th century playwright whose plays were extremely influential in Joyce's writing. Specifically, Joyce's play Exiles that I mentioned earlier was heavily influenced by Ibsen's work and style, excessively so to a fair amount of critics. Joyce's Last Words. The story is likely apocryphal, but the last words of Joyce are commonly said to be, "Does nobody understand?" which is pretty interesting considering his very difficult novels. Collected Epiphanies of James Joyce. This refers to a large number of early short sketches Joyce wrote, many of which he later reused or adapted in his novels. They're pretty interesting to read, though definitely not among Joyce's better work. F.W. Sigla. The various major characters of Finnegan's Wake each have their own sigla associated with them. A siglum in this context is a symbol or icon, and each character has one representing them. For example, Humphrey has the acronym HCE, his initials, and Izzy has two-letter I's placed next to each other to represent her eyes. The sigla sometimes appear in the book itself encoded in the text, but some of them are mainly used in the initial writing process to help Joyce remember what each character was referred to. Joyce coined quark. The term quark, referring to the subatomic particle, was coined by the scientist Murray Gell-Mann. He already had the pronunciation in mind, but he found the spelling through the phrase 3 quarks for muster mark. The phrase is found in Part 2, Chapter 4 of Finnegan's Wake, and are spoken by a chorus of birds mocking King Mark in the legend of Tristan and Isolde, which is retold in the chapter. To Ulysses. This refers to a quite funny satirical article written by Tom Lennon and available on his website, detailing the background and plot of the lost sequel to Ulysses, To Ulysses. I definitely recommend giving it a read if you're a Joyce fan. Alice Illusions. Finnegan's Wake is inspired by Lewis Carroll's book Alice in Wonderland, and references it several times throughout the novel, mainly through oblique puns. Seeing as they're both books about dreams, it makes sense. Thunderwords. 10 so-called Thunderbirds appear throughout Finnegan's Wake, all being very long words. The first 9 are 100 letters each while the last is 101. The words are mainly compounds made up from many words of different languages, usually of a certain theme. For instance, the first thunder word is made up of names in various languages for thunder, which is where the name comes from. FW and Vico. Finnegan's Wake is heavily inspired by the work of 18th century philosopher Giambattista Vico. Specifically, the four-part structure of the book is based on his idea of the four-part cycle of human history, being the ages of gods, heroes, humans, and the Ricorso, where the cycle loops back around. The parts of Finnegan's Wake are based in ordering and theme on this cycle, along with several other references and puns on Vico scattered throughout the novel. FW and TV. In Part 2, Chapter 3 of Finnegan's Wake, part of the narrative concerns a war story being broadcasted over a television in Humphrey's pub. This is pretty interesting, since the novel was published in 1939, quite a while before TVs and pubs were a common sight, so this was pretty predictive of the future. The Day of the Rabblement. The Day of the Rabblement is the title of an early essay of Joyce's published in 1901. The essay is an attack against the Irish Literary Theatre, a theatrical project designed to Irish playwrights and performers to have a way to have their works produced. Joyce found the project, to quote Britannica, to, quote, cater to popular taste, unquote, which, as you may expect by now, Joyce disliked about it. 1132. Throughout Finnegan's Wake, the number 1132 recurs in various forms. The number has several possible meanings or reasons for its usage in the novel. One popular theory is that it refers to the year that the Abbess of Kildare, a monastery in Ireland, was raped, and the abbey was burned by the King Dermot MacMurrough, an important event in Irish history that is also referenced elsewhere in Joyce's bibliography. Joyce Museums. Several museums centered around Joyce exist, particularly in Ireland. These include the James Joyce Tower and Museum and the James Joyce Centre, both in Dublin. Joyce and Yeats' relationship. Joyce and William Butler Yeats, another famous Irish writer, had a complicated relationship throughout the years. Joyce was a noted admirer of Yeats' poetry, and did even discourage him from doing more poetry than he intended to, since he thought he could never top Yeats' work. Joyce's in-person interactions with Yeats can be tense, and Joyce displayed a bit of admittedly justified arrogance about his work, but both men also appreciated the other's work. Yeats is referenced fairly frequently throughout Joyce's novels as well, if you know where to look. The Dead, 1987 film. The Dead is the title of a 1987 film adapting the final story in Joyce's Dubliners, also titled The Dead. The film follows the book fairly closely, and was praised upon release, being probably the most well-liked Joyce adaptation to date. Bloom, 2003 film. Bloom is the title of a 2003 film adapting Ulysses. The film got pretty bad reception, worse than the 1967 Ulysses adaptation, and is mostly forgotten now among Joyce and film fans. Joyce on Sgt. Pepper. The cover art of the Beatles' 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band famously depicts the band standing in front of a large crowd of historical figures. One of these historical... Tier 4. Fanu influence. The author Sheridan Le Fanu and his work heavily influenced Finnegan's Wake, particularly Fanu's 1863 novel The House by the Churchyard. That novel and Finnegan's Wake both share a location, the Dublin village of Chapelizod, and Finnegan's Wake makes several puns on the novel's title throughout its runtime. The Producers. The Producers is a 1967 black comedy film directed by Mel Brooks. The film features as one of its main characters an accountant named Leopold Bloom, which was of course taken from Ulysses. Volta Electric Theatre. The Volta Electric Theatre is the name of a former cinema in Dublin that was originally started by Joyce in 1909. His motivation for making this was to bring a cinema to Ireland, since before this none existed in the country. Joyce sold the cinema to a company after 7 months due to being unhappy with the lack of Irish films being shown compared to British and Italian ones. The cinema's ownership changed hands several more times after this, until it eventually closed for good in 1948. Reading James Joyce. This refers to a blog entitled Reading James Joyce, which, according to its description, is a blog, quote, in which I read works by James Joyce and write about my experiences, unquote. The blog mainly consists of posts about Joyce's work, specifically about the blogger's experiences as she rereads his books. It looks like it hasn't been posted to in about 3 years, unfortunately. Finnegan Wake, Monster High. Monster High is a multimedia franchise of dolls manufactured by Mattel, mainly focusing on monster-themed dolls. One of them was named Finnegan Wake, He was more likely named after an Irish comic ballad of the same name that is the source for the novel's title, but it is possible he's named after the novel. Passages from Finnegan's Wake, 1967. This is the title of a 1967 experimental film adapting selected passages from Finnegan's Wake, as the title implies. It's gotten decent reviews and is probably worth a watch if you're a fan of the book. Joyce Tools. Joyce Tools is the title of a website containing useful information for Joyce's novels, including maps of Dublin, copies of newspapers, and publications and essays about Joyce's works. It's a pretty cool website. O Felix Culpa. Felix culpa is a Latin phrase that means happy fault, used especially in Christianity to refer to the idea that the fall of man had positive effects, particularly the whole Jesus Christ saving everyone thing. The phrase is used in various pun forms several times throughout Finnegan's Wake, which makes sense considering the novel's motif of the fall of man. Dubliners 100. Dubliners 100 is the title of a 2014 collection of short stories, published on the 100th anniversary of Dubliners' release. The collection contains rewrites or new takes on the 15 stories of Dubliners by 15 other Irish writers, whose versions of the story range from fairly straight retellings to more out-there versions, such as ones taking place in the modern day. It's a pretty interesting collection. China Loves F.W. Dai Kongrong's translation of the first third of Finnegan's Wake into Chinese in 2013 became a surprise hit in the country, selling significantly more copies than expected, especially among less academic readers. I have no idea how one could even translate Finnegan's Wake into a different language, but apparently you can. June 16th, The Minutemen. June 16th is the title of a song by the punk band Minutemen off their 1984 album Double Nickels on the Dime. The song is instrumental, but the title was named as a reference to the day Ulysses takes place on. Antwerp James Joyce Center. The Antwerp James Joyce Center is a website dedicated to analysis and study of his works of Joyce. It contains a large amount of articles, essays, and other similar material. It's a cool website, lots of good stuff on it. Daedalus, 2018. Daedalus is the title of a pretty obscure 2018 film. The film was presumably named after Stephen Daedalus, but the film's plot doesn't seem to have anything to do with Joyce's work, so I'm not entirely sure what the link is. The film got pretty bad reviews, unfortunately. GRRM in Joyce. In George R.R. Martin's fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire, River Run is the name of a castle. The name is a reference to the first word of Finnegan's Wake, which is also River Run. Michael Cusack, The Citizen. The Citizen is a character from Ulysses featured most extensively in Chapter 12 of the novel, in which he is used as an analog to the Cyclops Polyphemus in the Odyssey. The Citizen is an anti-Semitic Irish nationalist who has an argument with Bloom, which ends with Bloom escaping after telling the Citizen, a devoted Christian, that his God is a Jew, which enrages the Citizen. The Citizen is mainly a satire and caricature of the Irish teacher Michael Cusack, who was evidently not nearly as terrible or bigoted of a person as the Citizen, but was notable for his prominent Irish nationalist beliefs. Ulysses was a Dubliner's story. The original idea for Ulysses was to have it be a brief short story in Dubliners, following a similar but significantly more condensed plot to the full novel. The idea slowly over several years grew into the idea for the fully realized version of Ulysses we have today. Tier 5. r/Finnegan's What. r/Finnegan's What is an obscure subreddit dedicated to posting and archiving notes and thoughts about Finnegan's Wake. It's unfortunately not very active, but it's a pretty neat subreddit. Joyce and 22. According to Reddit user u/Medici Martinez77, quote, Finnegan's Wake contained numerous lists. Many of them have 22 items. Ulysses was originally planned to have 22 chapters. The 22 letters of Hebrew alphabet and 22 tarot majors were a cornerstone of the Hermetic cults in the 1900s. The opening line of Ulysses has 22 words. Many of the financial calculations in Ulysses can be rearranged in such a way to include the number 22. End quote. Ulysses was also published in 1922, and Joyce was 22 during 1904, when Ulysses takes place. F.W. into Oz. I couldn't find much about this entry, but I assume it makes a connection between Finnegan's Wake and the children's fantasy series The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Not sure what the connection would be, though. If anyone knows, please alert me. Clive Hart's Wake Schemata. This refers to a schema created by Joyce scholar Clive Hart for Finnegan's Wake, modeled after the Gilbert and Lunati schemas for Ulysses mentioned earlier. It's pretty helpful for diagramming the novel. Joyce's 12 Critics. This entry refers to a 1929 essay collection entitled Our Examination Around His Factification for Incamination of Work in Progress. The collection contains 12 essays on Finnegan's Wake, at the time called Work in Progress, which were only available in excerpts published in magazines and the like when they were written. The essays were each written by a different critic, with one including the later famous author Samuel Beckett. ALP's Gift. In Part 1, Chapter 8 of Finnegan's Wake, the narrative describes Anna Livia Pluribel delivering 111 presents to her 111 children, which includes some very odd gift choices. This is presumably what this entry refers to. Joyce and Spengler. Oswald Spengler was a philosopher most known for his lengthy work The Decline of the West, published in 1922. I couldn't find much about his connection to Joyce, though. If anyone knows, please alert me. Epic Geography. Epic Geography, James Joyce's Ulysses, is the title of a 1976 nonfiction book by Michael A. Seidel. The description of the book reads, quote, in proposing that places, movements, and directions are deeply implicated in the narrative structure of Ulysses, Michael Seidel contends that Joyce recreates in Dublin the significant epic geography of the Odyssey. The author demonstrates how Joyce adjusts the spaces of Ulysses to accommodate the three theaters of Homeric action, as mapped by Victor Berard's Lex Phoenicians et l'Odyssey. End quote. Seems like an interesting read. Page 439 FW film. Page 439 of Finnegan's Wake is an experimental short film that adapts a small excerpt of Finnegan's Wake. It's a pretty interesting watch. Marshall McLuhan and Joyce. This likely refers to philosopher Marshall McLuhan's 1968 nonfiction book, War and Peace in the Global Village. Part of the book discusses Finnegan's Wake, and more specifically its 10 thunder words, which are claimed to be representative of 10 stages of human history, from the Paleolithic to the invention of television. It's a dubious theory, but it is interesting. Delaney's Rejoice. Rejoice is the title of a podcast hosted by Frank Delany. It goes through Ulysses very slowly and analyzes the book in great detail. The podcast was unfortunately cut short by Delany's death, but despite this, it is still commonly recommended as one of the best secondary resources for understanding Ulysses. The Coach with the Six Insides. This is the title of a 1962 musical stage adaptation of Finnegan's Wake, created by Jean Erdman, who interestingly was the wife of Joseph Campbell, who wrote the guide to Finnegan's Wake mentioned earlier. Erdman also performs in the play. The adaptation is an interesting watch. Would not have expected that book of all ones to get a musical version. Yeats/Bruno Wheel. Giordano Bruno was a 16th century philosopher who was quite influential on Joyce, particularly Finnegan's Wake, where, like with Vico, Joyce made a large amount of references to Bruno and his work. The memory reel is a mnemonic device created by Bruno that helps one to remember stuff. Or something. I can't really find much about how it works, sorry. Frances A. Yates was a writer who talked about the memory wheel in her 1966 nonfiction book The Art of Memory. What connection this has to Joyce, I have no idea, apart from him referencing Bruno. I couldn't find anything about it. Sorry. Scheming Pension's Ulysses. Scheming Pension is a blog that is, according to its description, quote, an amateur Joycean likewise interested in the Joycean illusions and works by Thomas Pynchon and William Gaddis, end quote. On the blog, there was a short story the author wrote for a contest hosted by James Joyce Quarterly. The contest was to write a new short story for Dubliners entitled Ulysses. The story the blogger wrote doesn't have much to do with the novel Ulysses besides featuring some side characters from it, but it's a pretty interesting read. Neil Kosely Meyer's Memorization. Neil Kosely Meyer is the name of an American man who is currently attempting to memorize Finnegan's Wake at the rate of a chapter a year. He should be currently in Part 2, Chapter 3. He apparently recites the chapter he's memorized each year around Christmas on stage in Seattle. Very impressive stuff. From Swerve of Shore to Bend of Bay, blog. From Swerve of Shore to Bend of Bay, named after the opening line of Finnegan's Wake, is a blog that talks about various Joyce-related topics. It doesn't update super often, but it's a neat blog. Waywards and Mean Signs. Quote, Waywards and Mean Signs, recreating Finnegan's Wake in its whole Hulume, set James Joyce Finnegan's Wake to music. The whole book. With readers and musicians from around the world, Waywords and Mean Signs is simultaneously an unabridged audiobook as well as musical adaptation. Our 2017 May 4th release features over 100 musicians, readers, and artists from 15 different countries. End quote. To quote the main page of the website. It's quite a cool project. Tier 6. Ulysses' Tree Theory. The closest thing I could find to this was an academic paper written by James Fairhall titled James Joyce and the Politics of Trees in Ulysses, which examines Ulysses through an eco-critical lens, particularly analyzing what its references to trees means about Ireland's history and current state. 50 Joycean Conjectures. This refers to an article on the blog Robot Wisdom Auxiliary, entitled 50-plus Joycean Conjectures Annotated. The article is a list of 53 Joyce-related claims or facts that are then fact-checked and analyzed. It's a pretty interesting read. Ulysses predicted Reddit. This refers to the line, quote, OP must work off bad karma first, end quote, from Chapter 9 of Ulysses. In context, OP stands for Ordinary Person, but the line does bear a striking similarity to original posters in the karma system on Reddit. Eumaeus is deliberately boring. Chapter 16 of Ulysses, also commonly called Eumaeus, is written in a tired, awkward, cliched style that is a little hard to get through, though also admittedly very funny. This style is intentional and likely meant to reflect the fact that both Bloom and Stephen are very tired, and Stephen particularly is very hungover. It could also reflect Bloom attempting to match Stephen's intellect by talking intelligently, which he does in the chapter, and he continually messes up and lets slip that he's not nearly as erudite as Stephen. Wandering Rocks as Microcosm. Chapter 10 of Ulysses, aka Wandering Rocks, contains 18 short episodes following various side characters of the book throughout Dublin as they go about their day. The chapter is likely meant to be a microcosm of the entire novel, since the chapter was 18 episodes, plus the final one following the entire cast, and the book also has 18 chapters. The chapter also reflects many of the book's overall themes about Dublin's culture, and is placed between the first 9 and last 8 chapters of the book, functioning as a dividing point for the two halves of the novel. Joyce Archic Principles. Archic does not appear to be a word, and I can't find anything about its principles connected to Joyce. If anyone knows what this means, please alert me. Ulysses' Aesthetic Symmetry. This could refer to a number of things in the way Ulysses is written, considering how tight of a novel it is, and how much symmetry there is. One example is that the book is divided into 3 parts, with parts 1 and 3 having 3 chapters each, while part 2 has 12 chapters. This also holds to stuff like the schemas mentioned earlier, with each chapter having its own dedicated organ, science, technique, and more. Ulysses is a very intricately planned out novel. Dubliners/Divine Comedy Parallels. Dubliners has, although subtle, some parallels to Dante's Divine Comedy that can be noticed with a keen look. For example, the first and last sentences of the book seem to parallel the gates of hell and the final layer of treachery in the Inferno. Most of the other parallels are more subtle, and to me it may be unintentional, but if you're wanting to read more about these, there's a great paper called Dante's Literary Influence in Dubliners, Joyce's Modernist Allegory of Paralysis by Michelle L. Lecure on the topic. Cyclops Dog Hypothesis. This refers to a theory put forth by Eiichiro Ito about Chapter 12 of Ulysses, or Cyclops. The chapter is the only fully first-person one in the book, and is from the perspective of a cynical man we never learn the name of. His only other appearance is briefly in Chapter 15, where he is referred to as the Nameless One. Ito's theory suggests that the man is actually a dog, and puts forth as evidence several strange phrases in the chapter, such as, quote, I turned around to let him have the weight of my tongue, end quote, as well as the fact that the chapter technically never says the narrator isn't a dog. I'm not sure if I believe this theory, but it's a very fun idea. The 17-year gap. This refers to Joyce's 17-year-long period between the release of Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Considering the depth and complexity of Finnegan's Wake, it's not too surprising it took him 17 years to write it. Anselm Kiefer, F.W. Anselm Kiefer, misspelled in the entry title, is a painter and sculptor. His 2023 project, Anselm Kiefer Finnegan's Wake, is comprised of sculptures and other artistic works meant to parallel and evoke Finnegan's Wake, which I'd say they succeed at. It's a pretty cool exhibit. Element and Moxham schemas. This refers to 2 different things. The first, the Ellman schema, refers to the Lunati schema mentioned previously, being first printed in a book by Richard Ellman, a prominent Joyce scholar and biographer. The second, the Moxham schema, refers to a project in the mid-90s by a professor named Bernard Moxham to, quote, commission 18 artists to work on various schemata by means of 18 pieces of a particular size. Each artist was to choose a category from a schema with 18 variations and to illustrate that schema. The result is work of great variety. Exhibitions focusing on individual episodes rather than individual artists' contributions, which are usually uniform in style throughout, bring about the desired multiplicity. End quote. This quote is from the book Joyce and Art, Visual Art, inspired by Joyce, by Krista Hayes. Sounds like an interesting project. Tier 7. Who was McGrath? McGrath is a figure mentioned several times in Finnegan's Wake in several chapters. The character appears to be a dark counterpart or parallel to Humphrey. Considering the fact that it's Finnegan's Wake, not much coherent about the character is said, so the precise details of him are uncertain. Whose dream was F.W.? Finnegan's Wake is presumably the dream of someone, but whose it is debated. According to Joyce, it's the dream of a man lying dead beside the river Liffey, though the truth of this statement is also debated. A common theory is that it's what Stephen dreams after going to sleep at the end of Ulysses, which is an interesting thought. Who was Macintosh? A mysterious man wearing a Macintosh raincoat is seen and mentioned many times throughout the Ulysses. His first appearance is in Chapter 6, while Bloom is attending his late friend Patty Dignam's funeral. No one else at the funeral appears to know who he is, and Bloom is quite interested in his identity. He also appears in person in Chapters 10, 14, and 15, and is thought about by Bloom and others many times for the rest of the novel. Very few clues about his identity are given out, with one of the only others being, besides his attire, being that he, quote, loves the lady who is dead, end quote, which is thought by the narrator of Chapter 12. His identity has spurred large amounts of debate among Joyce scholars, and there are several theories as to who he could be, including the ghost of Bloom's dead father, or a cameo from a self-insert of Joyce himself. Where is Phoenix Park in Ulysses? Despite being a prominent plot point in Finnegan's Wake, the park in Dublin called Phoenix Park makes very few appearances in Ulysses. Only a few occasional mentions and one very brief segment in Chapter 10 taking place in it are included. It's a strange choice, considering how large the park is and how dedicated Joyce was to making sure Dublin was accurately captured in Ulysses. What is UP? A recurring minor plot point in Ulysses is that of a mysterious postcard the side character Dennis Breen received. The postcard reads UP up, and it's never explained what this means or who sent it. It must be something particularly bad, though, since during the period of the novel, Dennis attempts to sue the anonymous sender for libel. How old is Gertie? In Chapter 13 of Ulysses, the first half centers around the young woman Gertie McDowell, who is on the beach with her friends and the 3 young children they're looking after. Throughout the chapter, Gertie notices a mysterious man looking at her who she begins to fantasize about and imagine a future life with. The man is eventually revealed to be Bloom, who is unsurprisingly doing something I can't mention on YouTube during this. She is most likely in her early 20s, but her exact age is unclear, with a few mentions of her age in the text having some grammatical ambiguity as to who of the 3 women it is referring to. Who is Miss Martha Clifford? In Ulysses, under the pseudonym Henry Flower, Bloom has been engaging in an epistolary affair with a woman named Martha Clifford, mainly comprised of them writing each other sexual letters. The true identity of Martha, as well as whether or not she is also using a pseudonym, is never fully revealed in the novel, and Bloom speculates in her identity throughout. A few more details about her are revealed, such as her being a typist, but not a whole lot. What was Bloom writing in the sand? At the end of Chapter 13 of Ulysses, after Bloom's experience with Gertie McDowell mentioned a bit earlier, Bloom writes a message in the sand of the beach directed towards Gertie in hopes that she'll see it the next day. The message's first 3 words are, I am a, but the last word was not written due to his running out of space to write it down. What he was intending to write is left unclear. Does Stephen jack off in Proteus? Near the end of Chapter 3 of Ulysses, aka Proteus, while Stephen is walking along Sandymount Strand, the text describes, in a rather opaque way, what appears to be him urinating. However, with how abstract the style is, it could also be describing him doing about what Bloom does later on the same beach. Scholars appear to be fairly split in what he's actually doing in this section of the chapter. Tier 8. The 4th book. Joyce's fourth major work is Finnegan's Wake, but what this is presumably referring to is his fourth novel, which never came to fruition. Joyce spoke about wanting to make his next work after Finnegan's Wake be a short, simple work about waking up by the ocean, as a way to parallel Ulysses being about the day and Finnegan's Wake the night. Unfortunately, he died before he could write this book. Cranley did not answer. This entry refers to the idea that Cranley, a character in a portrait of the artist as a young man who was a friend of Stephen's, was in a gay relationship, or at least a heavily homoerotic friendship with Stephen. This idea is not completely unsupported in the text, with especially the passage referenced in the entry name being quite gay-sounding. FW is the thesaurus of story plots. I assume this is a theory about how Finnegan's Wake, with its massive amount of stories referenced in its pages, and with its habit of constantly comparing and making parallels between stories, could almost function as a thesaurus of story plots. This actually makes a decent amount of sense. Bloom's secret condom. During Chapter 18 of Ulysses, in Molly's long soliloquy, she imagines going through Bloom's pockets the next day and finding a hidden condom, indicating she believes Bloom cheated on her during the day, which she isn't too wrong about. Nick S. Williamson. U/Nick S. Williamson is a Reddit user who's been fairly active and contributed a great deal to the r/James Joyce subreddit in the past, especially in the field of comments. There's a lot of pretty insightful and interesting analysis you can find in his comments. The New Beginning, FW. I assume this is another reference to the cyclical structure of Finnegan's Wake, with the last sentence connecting with the first in a sort of endless loop. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? This obviously refers to the classic philosophical problem of whether the chicken or the egg came first, but what connection this has to the works of Joyce, I am not sure, sorry. If anyone knows, please alert me.